Hi, I'm Pam, and I would like to welcome you to the Live Authentically show. On my show, I talk to people about how they live authentic lives and about how they help others connect to the essence of who they are. I would love to invite you to join my Facebook group where we have a group of like-minded individuals committed to their spiritual growth and transformation. You can find us at liveauthentically.today/FB. I'm super excited to be launching my first book. It will be out in early 2020, and it's a spiritual journey through my personal growth and transformation and self-actualization, and contains all of the keys that you need to unlock the secrets of the universe so that you can create the reality that you desire. On today's show, I am delighted to have with us Lori Erickson. Lori is a travel writer who specializes in spiritual journeys. So Lori, welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you for having me.
You're welcome. Thank you. I'm delighted that you've taken time out of your day to be here and share all of your experiences and wisdom with us. Before we dive into kind of what you do and what sets your soul on fire, your passions, experiences, etc., I always start the show off with the same question, and that is, what does it mean to you to live authentically every day?
Well, I think it means listening to the inner voice, and I think it takes practice to listen. I think all of us have that voice present from the time that we're conscious, but part of what comes with age, I think, is an ability to hear that still small voice. And so I think it can mean a variety of things in a variety of ways to live authentically, but I think the heart of it is that sort of listening to spirit, to inner voice.
Right. And I have found that as well through my life experiences. For so many years, I lived kind of in that headspace where I tried to apply logic and reason and analysis and pros and cons lists. And it wasn't until I experienced some challenging situations that I learned to just sit in stillness and sit in that tranquil space and just listen to what my soul had to say.
Mm-hmm.
And but that takes practice, right? It's not something that comes overnight. I believe that we all have it. It's all there. We can cultivate it, but we have to kind of peel back and sift through the layers of what life has kind of piled on over the years.
Mm-hmm.
So that being said, what words of wisdom do you have, like, to somebody who says, you know what, but I don't know how to even access I don't even know how to hear my inner voice. How do I tap into that innate wisdom, that inner voice, that inner, guidance system?
Well, I think that there are time-honored techniques, meditation, prayer, communal rituals, but my particular focus has been, professionally and personally both, has been sacred places. And the sense that there are some places where we are able to listen to that inner voice or have access to deeper wells of spirit and energy that we would not have access to other ways. And so in my work, I try to write about those places, experience them myself. And I think, travel in general can be very mind expanding and help us learn in all sorts of ways. But I think spiritual travel to places that are holy in a religious sense or in terms of natural beauty or our own sacredness that we bring to it. I think that that experience can open up a different type of meaning in travel. And that's what I write about in my work.
Okay, and I definitely would love to get into that on the show. But what I always like to do first, before we start talking about what we do today, is I love to hear what led you to this place. Has spirituality, has traveling to sacred spaces always been part of who you are? Was it part of your upbringing? Was it part of your childhood, and that's something you carried into your adulthood? Or was it a particularly moving life experience that caused you to dig really deep and seek out those spiritual places?
Mm-hmm. Well, I have an unusual background for a travel writer in that I never traveled anywhere when I was growing up. I grew up on a dairy farm in Iowa, and when you have cows, you have to stay at home to milk them. And my parents also weren't travelers, even if they would have not had that anchor. So I grew up it was a wonderful childhood, but it was a very tightly circumscribed childhood. And then once I reached young adulthood and first experienced travel in college, it opened up an entirely new world for me. And so I ignited a lifelong fascination for travel. And And my fascination for spirituality, I would say, was present from the time I was a young age as well. But I didn't connect the two for quite some time. And so they ran really on parallel tracks in my life. Um, so my passion for travel was both a personal interest, but also I started becoming a travel writer. My spiritual path was expressed through wandering through a variety of traditions. I grew up Christian, Lutheran, and
Mm-hmm.
then in my early 20s, wandered through a variety of traditions, New Age beliefs, Buddhism. I was a Unitarian for a number of years.
Mm-hmm.
I was a Wiccan for a while. And eventually I came back to Christianity, but still have tried to keep that same broad-minded approach to spirituality. So, and at a certain point, about 15 years ago, I decided it was really silly to keep those parallel tracks separate.
Mm-hmm.
That travel and spirituality, there is such a natural intersection of those two broad streams in the idea of pilgrimage, which is almost certainly the oldest form of travel that humans have. And since then, it really reignited a real passion for me for my work and in my personal life as well.
And so what are your, when you travel to a particular site, do you go in with certain objectives, such as connecting to higher realms, or what are your objectives when you go to different places?
I like to say that I never feel so much alive as when I'm in a new place. And that's one of the
Mhm.
reasons why I love to travel. And so I think the first thing I try to do is simply to be open, notice as much as I can through
Mhm.
all of my senses. And I like to, part of that is observing people, because I think that one of the reasons why holy places touch people, it's not just an individual experience. It's both the communal experience of other people who might be there, but also people who have gone there in the past. And I
Mhm.
think that there are a lot of places where at some level we can sense that this has been a prayed in place for many, many centuries.
Mhm.
And then, in terms of, being just sort of a sponge and soaking up all of those impressions. But also, I think that stillness is part of it too. And I think that's often what holy sites draw out of us, is a
Mhm.
desire to be quiet and still and listen. And so I don't think there's a formula, but I do think there are certain practices that help. Um, so listening in particular and observing.
I think that's just so important. Like you said, just being open, just showing up and being open to the experience. Was
Mhm.
there a particular experience or trip that stood out in your mind as being particularly moving or soul stirring?
Mhm. So there's some holy sites that I visited just once and have been very powerful. Lourdes in France, for
Okay.
example, or Machu Picchu in Peru.
Mhm.
But a holy site that I've gone to again and again that has been a steady source of inspiration for me is Bear Butte in South Dakota, which is
Oh,
a place that not a lot of people have heard about. It's a state park, but long before it was a state park, it was a sacred site for Plains Indian tribes, especially the Lakota and the Cheyenne. And it's near the Black Hills, but it's not part of the Black Hills. It's an ancient volcano worn down over millions of years that is just its own solitary marker on the plains.
hmm.
And it's a place for vision quests, for sacred ceremonies by the Lakota and other native tribes. But there's also a hike to the top that anyone can take. And because my in-laws lived in the area, I started going to it just whenever we visited them. And gradually the power of that place seeped into me. And so one of the things I like to say about Bear Butte is that it taught me about sacred places. And it taught me through the repetition of being there usually once a year, of the opportunity for reflection. And I think that the fact I was there just once a year helped with that, because
Hmm.
it was a natural sort of time to reflect back on the previous year and look ahead to the next year. And so there are a lot of innate uh, aspects of the spiritual ritual relating to holy sites that was true for me at Bear Butte even before I realized what I was looking for there.
Okay. Wow. And that sounds like an incredible experience. It
Mm-hmm.
is amazing when you can go and you can feel so moved and so connected and just so drawn back to. I've traveled to places before where I definitely feel a connection. In
Mm-hmm.
Sedona, I'm curious, have you ever been to Sedona,
I
Arizona?
have. Yeah, I
Have
love
you? Okay.
Sedona.
I was
Oh, yeah. Uh-huh.
I
Uh-huh.
was there just one
Beautiful.
time this past summer. I did a spiritual journey, a spiritual retreat there. And part of that retreat was traveling to different vortexes around the
Yeah.
area, and where the veil is really thin, and walked a labyrinth. And it was just such a moving experience. I
Mm-hmm.
definitely plan to go back there. So it is
Yeah.
interesting how we can feel that draw to go back to certain
Uh-huh.
places.
Uh-huh. No, I think Sedona is a very special place. I think the landscape there, the red rocks and the light,
Mhm.
it's a remarkable spiritual site,
It is.
spiritual center.
It
Mhm.
is. I know one thing that you talk about in your videos, I know, and is a big piece of your work, is helping people to integrate the idea of mortality and death into their human experience. And I'd love to really kind of dive in and go deep here, because I know, there are some topics that are hard for people to talk about. And I think death, and I personally think that, at least based on my human experience so far, that I believe that grief and loss is one of the hardest things that we're called to deal with in this human existence. At least it has been for me,
Mhm.
because it's a topic that isn't, at least in my upbringing, wasn't talked about a lot. I didn't have any early experiences with
Mhm.
death and dying and grief and loss. And I remember wasn't until I was 29, I was pregnant with our first child, and I miscarried the baby. And the doctor said to me, "Death is part of life." And it took me a while to get my head wrapped around that concept, because I had never grieved the loss of an immediate family member. I thought that death and dying and grief and loss was something that other people only had to deal with. And it wasn't until I was in that moment, and it was, and not only did I have to learn to deal with death and loss and, that grief and loss in that moment, but I had to learn to deal with it out of sequence, right? I
Yeah.
mean, the loss of a pregnancy. So that was one of my early experiences. My heart was reeling, and I started to dig really, really deep as a result of that. And I think that it behooves everyone to reflect on the idea of death, incorporating death into life, and it enriches our life experiences. I know that I take that experience, and that has made me a better mom for our children that we were able to bring into this world. And that's what gives us the depth and richness. So I'd love for you to speak about that a little bit, about why that's such an important part of your work, coming to terms with our mortality, connecting to loved ones, etc., and how that actually can enrich our life experience.
Mhm. Mhm. Well, I certainly agree with the insights that you brought up, and I'm sorry for the loss of that baby.
Thank
That's
you.
a very, very hard loss.
Thank you.
Um, my own experience with loss most recently was several years ago, when my 59-year-old brother died unexpectedly of a heart attack.
I'm
The
sorry.
same week, my mother went into memory care in a nursing home, and in my grief and sorrow, and in trying to find tools to navigate that hard transition,
Mhm.
I turned to travel, which has always been a source of inspiration for me. And I got to thinking about the places I've been that had helped me learn about mortality, and also places I could go to learn about mortality. And so my latest book, which came out last August, is a result of that. And it's called Near the Exit: Travels with the Not So Grim Reaper.
Wow.
And it's a mixture of places far away, like Valley of the Kings in Egypt, and Mayan temples in Mexico and Guatemala, and places much closer to home, like the nursing home where my mother lived for several years, and
Mhm.
graveyards and funerals. And as you could maybe tell from the subtitle of the book, Travels with the Not So Grim Reaper, it's not a depressing book. At least I hope it's not. It's very much a life-affirming book. But I learned a number of things through those travels relating to mortality. One is the universality of these questions. There are Neanderthal burials that have been excavated by archaeologists that show evidence of ritual behavior,
Mhm.
of grey goods left with them, of flowers left with them. And so humans have been dealing with these issues for a long time. At the
Mhm.
same time, the flip side of that is the tremendous variety of cultural practices relating to death and mourning and grieving. And I learned from some of those. So, for example, one of the chapters is on a trip I took with Maori, the indigenous people of New Zealand. And the Maori, like many peoples throughout history and in the world today, have a strong sense of ancestors and the belief that certain ancestors remain with them, and that it's not surprising that they would give you guidance, that you would be able to call on them. And that was one of the mind-opening experiences I had while researching that book, was this sense of, well, everyone dies, but if you have a sense of ancestors, as many people throughout human history have had, that puts an entirely different layer of meaning on it. And so that's just one example of the ways in which I learned a lot through the research and the writing of that book. And I got the chance to reflect on both my own experience, but I hope maybe open up some doors for other people too when they read the book.
My curiosity is definitely piqued, and it's definitely something I would like to read. Is connecting with loved ones who have passed before us, is that something that you do as part of your daily practice, as part of your again, daily practices and rituals and routines to keep them alive and well in your life and your memory?
So I wouldn't say it's a daily practice, but I would say largely as a result of those losses and writing that book, it is part of my consciousness now in a way that it wasn't before. But the practice that I write about in my book, and that I have taken on as my own in my own personalized way, is the Mexican practice of Day of the Dead, which is, as perhaps you know, November 1st and 2nd. It's a time when people go to graveyards. The belief is that the dead come back for that time, and they have the chance to feast with them and honor them. And then the dead go away again. And so I love that cyclical nature of that, the fact that it's a ritualized behavior, and it's a holiday, it's celebratory, but it also has an element of loss and mourning to it.
Right.
And so I think it's a very healthy practice that I think is certainly spreading, but I wish it was more widespread.
Is that something you've participated just in firsthand then, or is that something
Yeah. So the introduction to my book is set at a Day of the Dead ceremony, or Day of the Dead festival in Chicago, in the neighborhood, which is the largest Day of the Dead festival in the United States. And then on the Day of the Dead's Days of the Dead since, I have done the practice in a limited way in my home. I mean, I don't live near where my loved ones are buried, and so that makes it hard. But to create an altar, an ofrenda, where I have pictures and tokens indicating the lives of the people that I love, and it's very meaningful to me to have.
I'm sure. And it feels like there'd be a healing component to going through
Absolutely.
that ceremony. Do you feel like it just offers that much more healing and that much more acceptance to coming to terms with loss?
Yeah. Well, and I think the central insight, and this is one that is universal, is the idea that when you live with the consciousness of death, it doesn't detract from life; it enhances it. And knowing that it's not going to last forever, either for yourself or the people you love, means that you treasure life all the more.
Right.
And I think we need reminding of that. There was a longstanding practice in the Middle Ages that scholars especially, would keep a skull on their desk as a constant reminder of what awaited them. And that can sound morbid, but there's also, I think, a really deep fundamental truth in that practice.
Right. I definitely agree. I know that for a lot of people, and I could say this was true for myself in my younger days, they have a fear of dying. I used to have a fear of dying, fear of death. Like the whole idea was something that I just avoided. So what are some things people can do on a regular basis, or just ideas for mindset shifts so they can move out of that place of fearing death and fearing dying, and integrate that in a healthy way into their life so that their lives can be enhanced as a result of that of that notion of death.
Mm-hmm. Well, we're fortunate in that we have a lot of resources, I think more all the time. A couple of books come to mind. One is a wonderful book by Kathleen Dowling Singh, Singh, a Buddhist teacher and hospice volunteer who wrote several books, the best of which I think is Grace in Dying. And she really draws on her Buddhist teachings as well as her experience at the bedsides of many dying people to try to demystify death and to view death. She came through her experiences. She came to view death as a process of natural spiritual enlightenment, and that even people who had avoided sort of the work of spiritual growth before have the chance at their deaths to do that work. Often, would be in a very condensed time if they, if depending on how their death occurs, of course.
Right.
So that's a really good resource. I think Atul Gawande's book, Being Mortal, is also another really great one. There are practices, a lot of them come from Buddhism, of visualizing your death. Meditation, I think, can be thought of as practice for death in the sense of closing your eyes, being in silence, being in darkness. And so lots of different practices. But I think, too, one of the most important things is to have conversations with your loved ones, for one thing, so that they know what your end-of-life wishes are, and also to help them prepare for your inevitable death as well.
Right. I think that's so powerful. I know, what someone had asked me recently, what motivates me, and I definitely do think about death and dying, and not in sort of a negative sense, but I actually I've overcome my fear, and now I use it, and I've been able to transmute that anxiety or fear associated to more productive endeavors. I've been able to transmute that into work that fuels my passions and helps other people. And one of the things that motivates me greatly, I actually even say this in my book about, the sobering truth is that we're all here for a limited time. And there are certain times I remember in my 20s, when you feel I felt invincible, I'm going to be here forever, and you don't really have that foresight or that knowledge to see that, we're not in that space where we're thinking that we're here for a limited time. And that's what motivates me greatly, is the passage of time. Knowing that every single day, every day we have is a gift, right? Every day is a gift. And every hour that we spend, just not productive or not happy is an hour we can never get back. And so that's something that motivates me greatly. And I've been able to overcome that fear, but I know it was a challenge for a while, but it is amazingly liberating and empowering once you can break through that and realize that, hey, this is an inevitable truth. This is something that's going to happen for all of us. And we have a choice. We have a choice as to how we live each day. What is next for you? What is next? Do you have your sights set on? Do you have your next trip planned? Do you have?
I have a book that my agent is shopping around, actually, which relates. In some ways, it's a natural outgrowth of the mortality book. It's about the soul of the family tree. It's about ancestors and about the current popularity of having your DNA tested and finding your ethnicity, and the ways in which that can be a tool for spiritual growth.
Okay, and can you give us a little bit of an idea of how that knowledge can be used to help shed light on who we are and help us learn about ourselves?
Sure.
How that information.
Well, part of it is the acknowledgement that I think genealogy, while it is one of the world's most popular hobbies, is also, I think, one of the world's most boring hobbies for anyone who is not personally related to the person or to the people that you're. I mean, it can too often be names and dates and sort of minutia that really, I think it can be interesting, but not really spiritually enriching. And so what I try to write about, though, is the ways in which learning that you're not just an individual, but that you are the product of generations of cultural forces and spiritual forces and historical forces, and that you yourself, through your descendants, nieces and nephews, if you don't have children yourself, also have an effect on those who come after you. And so there's a wonderful image from, I'm of Scandinavian descent, and the Norse, the Vikings of pre-Christian Scandinavia had the idea of urlag, which is a word for the inherited web that you are given at your birth, that you are embedded in almost like a big Afghan that's been knitted for many, many centuries. And you add a new thread to that. But who you are and who that thread is really dependent upon the choices made by people who came before you. And
Mhm.
also that it's possible to send healing back. And I think that's a really powerful idea, because many of us, of course, have a lot of trauma in our family lines. And that's part of, I think, the healing that many people need to undergo is a recognition that their pain is a result often of things that were far, far beyond their control. But maybe there's something they can do with it in this life.
Right. Are there any healing modalities that you would recommend that people, if they feel like they're carrying traumas that have been passed down in their DNA through other generations? Are there
Mhm.
any healing modalities or any places or resources that you could point people to?
Well, I think certainly a good therapist can
Right.
start to untangle some of that. But I think especially a therapist who has a spiritual sense. And in my book, I write about actually some of the techniques from Old Norse traditions that some people are bringing back, having to do with prayer and rituals. But I think that that's probably a really long conversation that I'm
Hmm.
probably not prepared the person to talk to about that. I just know a little bit about them, but I'm no expert by any means.
Okay, well, thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
What I'd love to talk to you about next is I know you mentioned you sort of tried on or explored a few different belief systems. You kind of made your way through some religions until you kind of settled back into where you felt most comfortable or what was most authentic to who you are. And I'd like to talk to you about this or hear what you have to say about this as people explore and create their belief systems. Because I know so many times, I grew up in a Catholic household. Faith was a big piece of who I was, but I couldn't see beyond the Catholic faith. I thought that I had a very narrow mindset. And as I went through the years, I started to question whether or not some of the beliefs that were passed down to me, that were bestowed upon me, that were chosen for me, really resonated with me. And I started to ask those questions. Do I actually believe this? And again, through challenging life experiences, I was sent on my own personal journey to explore what is my belief system. And I know people do explore different religions. I went just within. It was a very individual journey for me, a spiritual journey. And after the early pregnancy loss that I mentioned, I lost another child in the very close to the end of the pregnancy. That sent me reeling, and that's when I really started to dive in deep, and started to separate, I guess, from the public worship nature. And I started to kind of go within, and it became an individual nature, individual journey. So I'm such a firm believer I'm a big proponent of choice. I advocate for my kids, myself. We have a choice. Sometimes we don't realize that, but we just kind of unconsciously accept what's being given to us or what's being passed down to us. But I encourage all of my kids, you know what? Don't feel like you need to stay in the Chicago area. As much as I'd love to have you stay close to home, if this is where I happen to be when they grow up and move out, view the world, view the United States, view the world as a menu. Choose where you want to live. I feel the same about religion. I think that I'm grateful for the Catholic foundation that was given to me. It gave me a faith-based foundation, but I'm encouraging all of my kids to figure out what works for them. They have a choice. I want you to live a life that is congruent with what you believe. So what words of wisdom do you have for people who say, I'm part of this religion, but I'm not sure if this really resonates with who I am? Can you tell me a little bit about your journey and what guidance you might give other people?
Mhm. Well, I certainly agree with what you had to say about the importance of choice. And I think we're fortunate to live in a time when we have that ability and have tremendous spiritual teachers available to us. Um, so and I think too, it's important to realize that at different times in your life, different paths are going to speak to you more clearly than others. And just because this is how someone feels now doesn't mean that that's necessarily what they'll be in 20 years or 30 years or longer than that. Um, I think that an analogy I like to use actually is with language. And that for me, the language that I grew up with was Christianity.
Mhm.
And that even though I left it behind before, at a certain point, I realized that I had a fluency with the language and the symbolism that I didn't have with other with other faiths that
Mhm.
I had briefly practiced. And so there are many people who can become fully fluent in Spanish or in Chinese or in Swahili and fully immerse themselves in that culture. But I couldn't do that. And so that's why I decided to return to Christianity. That said, I think that any tradition has really toxic ways of practicing it and ways that are pretty dead and also really vital ways. And I have been deeply drawn to the mystical paths in a variety of different traditions, Christianity and Judaism and Islam, and it's a strain throughout a lot of different faiths. And I think too, I think the older we get, often the more we turn inside for answers. And I think that that can be very powerful and very valuable. But at the same time, I do think that an important part of the spiritual path is community, and that can be it can be lonely, making it up, developing your own path.
Right.
And I think especially there come times when you don't have the ability, we don't have the ability to carry it on ourselves. I think especially in times of grief or questioning. And that's the time I think when you want to be in a community that can say, we'll support you during this.
Mhm.
And you don't have to believe, because in a sense we'll believe for you.
Right.
Um, so, but I think everybody has to find their own path, and I'm grateful to live in a time when so many people are exploring. And I think that keeping an open mind and meeting the best of a religion rather than focusing on just the negative also is important. I mean, one of the things that I think was, if you do much reading or study of religions, you realize that there are negative parts to every single path. That humans are humans, and that doesn't mean that there isn't goodness there as well.
Right. Right. Thank you for sharing that. Are there any challenges that you encounter through your work that, have you encountered any challenges that were unexpected? And if so, how did you navigate those?
Mhm. Well, I would say that from a writer's point of view, that the challenges of publishing these days,
Mhm.
with the proliferation of work on the internet that people read for free,
Mhm.
and so the idea of making money from your writing it's a very different model these days, and so the challenges of traditional publishing are greater than ever before, I think. At the same time, there are a lot of benefits, and uh, people like you and me, we're able to have websites and podcasts and get
Right.
the word out. But there's such a fire hose of information out there that it's hard to get your voice to stand out. And so I think that's the major problem I face.
Mhm. And I know that that can be challenging, but again, I love how you always reframe everything and you always come back to the positive. And there are a number of different modalities that we all can use to get our voice out there. And I'm such a firm believer in the universe will match people up who are supposed to be together. So just by being in public forums, by being in venues where we're more visible, the
Mm-hmm.
people who are meant to be in our paths will be magnetized to us. And so
Mm-hmm.
I think it's just so
I
important.
like to think that too. Yes.
Yeah. And I always, I too like to reframe things in the positive. And, we can't manifest something and harbor that vibration or that thought of doubt. So sometimes, I'm like, no, I'm like anybody else, sometimes, as much as I love my book and I think it has a powerful message, those thoughts of doubt kind of creep in, like, is anybody going to buy this? Is this going to be valuable? And then you kind of have to shift back into that belief, right? That belief of, yes, I'm passionate about what I do. And I think that the universe recognizes kind of the spirit of what you're putting out there, and you're coming at it through the heart. If you're coming at it through the soul, you're coming at it from a place of wanting to enrich the lives of others. It can happen no other way than to have a ripple effect and affect others' lives in a positive way, much like your work is doing. And I'm so thrilled that you were able to share so much of it with us.
Well, thank you very much. I've enjoyed our conversation.
What is your next destination? Do you have your next trip?
I am going to Ohio, which doesn't sound very exciting, I know, but I'm very excited to see the Serpent Mound,
Oh,
which
tell me
is,
about that.
um, The Serpent Mound is the largest prehistoric earthen effigy mound in North America. So it was created probably about 2,000 years ago.
Okay.
It's a massive snake, about a quarter of a mile long, that winds up a hillside.
Oh.
And it's part of a whole network of prehistoric, pre-Columbian earthen works. A lot of them in the Ohio River Valley, a lot of them along the Mississippi. And so I'm going to go on a trip to investigate the ones in Ohio.
Oh,
Very
neat.
excited about it.
Do you take a lot
You
of
don't have to
pictures?
go abroad in order to find amazing spiritual sites.
Right. Oh, that's amazing. Do you take a lot of pictures on your trips?
My husband does. My husband is a photographer,
Oh, how
retired,
perfect.
and he really dived into photography in a big way. So he's got a big Instagram following, and
Oh,
also it's really handy to have a photographer in the family.
I'm sure it is. And one of the reasons that I asked that was because I know I often struggle, whether I'm traveling or just trying to, navigate everyday life. I want to capture the moment, but yet I want to live in the moment. And
Right.
so I was going to ask you how you balance those. But if you have a built-in photographer, that's not an issue for you.
It helps. It helps. It's
Right.
hard to balance both the writing and the photography because they're different. They're different skills.
Definitely
Um,
different skills, but both in that creative realm, and they both
right.
go hand in
Right.
hand. So I love photography as well. I kind of dabbled in it. I pull my fun camera out every once in a while when,
Uh-huh.
when I travel, and it's definitely very fun. It's any of
Yeah.
those creative
Yeah.
endeavors,
Yeah.
super fun. So,
Um,
well, I would like to thank you for being on my show. I'm delighted that you've joined me.
oh, thank you.
And if people would like to get in touch with you directly, how can they access you and your work?
My website is laurieerickson.net, and contact information is on there.
Great. Thank you so much. I would like to
Yeah,
thank you. I would like to thank all of our viewers and listeners for joining us today. Time is a choice, and I'm so grateful that you've consciously chosen to be with us for this hour today. Once again, would love to have you join our Facebook group. You can find us at liveauthentically.today/FB, and you will be surrounded by a group of like-minded people who are committed to their spiritual growth and transformation. And again, just a reminder, stay tuned for details on my book launch. And I hope you all have a great day.